When the great Scottish poet and novelist Sir Walter Scott waxed lyrical about the nation of his birth in the Lay of the Last Minstrel, he presented an image of Scotland full of power and majesty. O Caledonia, stern and wild, meet nurse for a poetic child. Land of brown heath and shaggy wood, land of the mountain and the flood. Land of my sires, what mortal hand can e'er untie the filial band that knits me to thy rugged strand? This celebration of Scotland and the patriotism that binds every true Scot to this rugged landscape, wherever they happen to live in the world, is as valid today as when the great man put pen to paper back in 1805. There's a passion to being a Scot, and although today the international perception of the country is ornately decorated with tartan and an over-exuberant helping of shortbread, there's much more to the many great Scottish traditions than might at first meet the eye of the thousands of visitors who travel north of the border year in, year out. Ask anyone to name you 10 things connected with Scotland, and always, amongst the haggis and the Loch Ness Monster, you'll hear the word whisky, uttered with a distinctive and reverent licking of the lips. The golden liquid synonymous with the absolute best of Scottish tradition has been created from the very same brown heath and flood that forged Sir Walter Scott's poetic child. Stern and wild is, in point of fact, a very fine description of the national drink of this rugged country, and without doubt, whisky is one of those rare concoctions that you have to understand before you can truly appreciate and love it. And so we begin on the Whisky Trail, a fascinating journey for the novice and experienced drinker of the wee dram alike, and although an hour is far too short a time to do justice to this wonderful subject, by the end of our tour you will at least have a thorough ongoing knowledge of Scotch whisky, and a measure or two of insider tips from the major distilleries still in operation today, to heighten your appreciation. Exactly how whisky came into being in Scotland is not precisely known, and there are a variety of interesting hypotheses as to how it all began. Some believe that monks from Ireland, intent on bringing Christianity to the wild Scots, also brought with them the recipe for the distillation of alcohol, a process widely practiced in Ireland since ancient times. However, it wasn't only the Irish that knew about a fine drop of the hard stuff. The Arabs had also worked out the alchemy required to turn innocuous ingredients into aqua vitae, the water of life. There are those that believe soldiers returning from the Crusades brought back these mysterious Arabian secrets and applied the principles to good old Scots barley. Equally, it could have been a cacophony of all this gleaned information, all thrown quite literally into the melting pot, along with reboiled porridge accidentally distilling away on an old peat fire. The term aqua vitae makes its first appearance in the Scottish history books in 1494, where there is an entry of malt being sold to one Friar John Corr to make the spirit. But the term whisky actually appears rather later, being derived from the Gaelic for water of life, Usqua Bay. In 1618, accounts of the funeral and wake of a Highland chieftain mentions Usqua as being served, and from this point onwards, Scotch whisky was produced in earnest. 17th century whisky making was a dangerous business, even though the actual procedure was straightforward enough. A sack of barley was soaked for a day or two in the running waters of a convenient burn before drying out for 10 days or so at room temperature, followed by the introduction of a smoky peat fire. The simple addition of water and yeast, which was then passed twice through a pot still, made for a remarkably potent mixture. Unfortunately, testing the whisky without today's modern equipment could be rather hit and miss, as the first and last parts of any given distillation were undrinkable, and in the case of the foreshots, extremely poisonous. Ascertaining the strength of the whisky called for an interesting experiment whereby gunpowder was added to the mixture. It took a brave man to set said concoction alight, but if it exploded, you knew you'd gone too far, and the whisky, to say the least, would be a wee bit too strong. It was also at this point in history that the eternal scourge of whisky taxation made its first very unwelcome appearance. Matters deteriorated rapidly with the Scottish and English Union of the Parliaments in the early 18th century, when English revenue officers were allowed to cross the border to sniff out illegal Scotch whisky production. Now, as any history book will tell you, the English were none too popular with the independent-minded Scots, and officious Sassenachs travelling north to tell them to cease their distillation was met with the utmost resistance. In fact, it became a point of principle to increase illicit whisky production to strike a blow against the English, and never was an act of defiant rebellion so greatly enjoyed by the people of Scotland. Although through the centuries since, whisky taxation has stabilised and distilleries have grown into fine licensed establishments, the romantic whisky drinker can't help but imagine that there might be just a few secret stills tucked away amongst these hills, producing a hitherto unknown golden blend yet to be discovered, for the good, of course, of all mankind. But whimsy aside, whisky production in Scotland today is big business, and if you walk into any bar or liquor store, you'll see a whole array of evocatively named Scotch whiskies to tempt your palate. For most people, their first taste of Scotch whisky will be a blended variety, and in truth, this can be a very good place to start. This process developed throughout the latter half of the 19th century for a number of reasons, but primarily the stronger flavour of the single malts, which we'll look at in more detail a little later, did not suit the taste buds of the growing export market. For the English, and partakers considerably further afield, the blending of both malt and grain whiskies allowed a far more widely acceptable result to be attained. Grain whisky is produced predominantly in the Scottish lowlands and matures more quickly than its fellow Highland malts. Incidentally, all whisky worthy of the name Scotch has to have matured for a minimum of 3 years, with grain whisky then perfectly suitable for consumption, whereas in practice malt whiskies are left to mature for at least 8 and often up to 15 or more years. Most of the well-known blended whiskies are produced by companies who own both malt and grain distilleries. One of the best-loved examples is Johnnie Walker, which is smooth in character with sweet and dry high notes in both maltiness and peatiness. Johnnie Walker himself was a licensed grocer from Kilmarnock who started blending in the 1820s, with his grandsons creating black and red label blends in the early 20th century. Along with Bell's, Haig and the famous Grouse, to mention but a few, blended Scotch whisky is greatly enjoyed all over the world and is by no means to be considered as a poor relation. A good Scotch whisky blender is a rare and talented individual with a highly developed sense of smell, as scent is used rather than taste to create the perfect balance. On average, blenders will mix up to 50 different whiskies in any one brand, but there's one of the J&B blends that actually uses a grand total of 116 malts and 12 grain whiskies, which certainly explains why the task requires such a great level of skill, and as consistency is absolutely vital, the nose of an expert whisky blender is a highly prized commodity within the modern day Scotch whisky industry. However, for many a whisky drinker, the ultimate progression as the connoisseur's palate develops is to the single Highland malt. And this is where our Whisky Trail begins in earnest. Our destination is Speyside in the northeastern Highlands, where more than half of Scotland's distilleries are in operation. When it comes to whisky production, Speyside has it all. The climate and geology of the Grampian Mountains, alongside the great glens bordering the River Spey, can only be described as perfect whisky country, and you will see numerous signposts for distilleries, many of which have wonderful visitor centres and provide fascinating guided distillery tours. This is Glenfiddich Distillery, and although it's one of the largest distilleries you'll get to visit, it's still a family business. Production of this most distinctive of single malts, with a light, peaty aroma, counterbalanced with a delightful sweetness, has gone on uninterrupted for over 100 years. A single malt simply means that the whisky is the product of just one distillery, but various proof strengths and ages of spirit will be mixed together to ensure a consistent end product. If you're a relative novice to whisky drinking and are only just starting to sample malt whisky, Glenfiddich is a great introduction. In the shadow of the ruins of Balvenie Castle, Glenfiddich is produced today with the traditional care and skilled expertise of generations of whisky distillers. The methods used are absolutely authentic, and William Grant, the former apprentice shoemaker who bought this land in the valley of the River Fiddick in 1886 to fulfil his dream of setting up a distillery of his own, would without doubt approve heartily. William Grant and his family worked tirelessly to create their exceptional single malt, and the Glenfiddich name very quickly became an assurance of quality. Crystal clear water from the Robbie Dhu Springs, the finest Scots barley, pure Highland air, and unusually small stills all contributed to make William Grant's Glenfiddich a unique and much loved single malt. As if to herald future success, the very first Glenfiddich spirit flowed from this very place on Christmas Day 1887, an auspicious beginning for what has since become one of the 21st century's best-selling whiskies the whole world over. This really is the perfect opportunity to take a look in close-up at how Scotch malt whisky is made. It will vary between distilleries, and Glenfiddich has specific ways of doing things, but these are the basic principles. Just like their Scottish forefathers who soaked their barley in a local burn, the malting process begins with barley being steeped in water. After 2 to 4 days, the barley is drained and spread across a large stone malting floor, where it is allowed to germinate. Some distilleries still turn the barley by hand daily, but many now have mechanised the process. After 8 to 12 days, an enzyme called diastase will have been produced, which converts the barley to starch and sugar solubles, known in the trade as green malt. At this point, germination needs to be halted, and this is done by drying in a malt kiln. These pagoda-shaped towers are a common sight along Speyside, and with their Oriental-style chimneys they look very exotic indeed. This peat furnace smokes the green malt, and often you will taste the peat flavour to a greater or lesser degree in the finished whisky. Next, the malt is passed through a mill, which it emerges from as roughly ground grist. This is then mixed with hot water in a large tub called a mash tun, where, when agitated, the soluble powdery barley starch dissolves into a brownish sugary liquid called wort. When this is drawn off, it leaves behind a husky solid known as draff, which is very rich in nutrients and is recycled into cattle feed. Once the wort has been cooled, it's transferred to washbacks, large wooden or stainless steel tubs, where yeast can be added to begin the fermentation process. It takes about 48 hours for this to happen, famously at 21 degrees. Now, there was a time when PC simply referred to a police constable, but in today's climate, where political correctness is a burning issue, it's almost controversial to say that the male-dominated whisky-making workforce of generations past remembered the temperature for this tricky stage by comparison with a woman of 21, which all sagely agreed was when she was at her most awkward. The resulting fermented liquid has a strength of about 7 degrees of alcohol and is unceremoniously named wash. And this is when the serious business of distillation begins. One of the most distinctive images that you'll see at any malt whisky distillery will be the beautifully bulbous, glistening copper stills used for this most crucial stage of whisky production. Little has changed with these great magical cauldrons in 200 years, and they are always made by hand, hammered out by highly skilled coppersmiths. You may ask, why copper in a modern world? Why not clinically spotless stainless steel? By all accounts, you'll have your answer if you're ever unfortunate enough to cut yourself on a sharp copper edge. The healing process will be in excess of a week faster than if it had been stainless steel, proving just how microscopically clean copper is. Also, copper is renowned for making the best possible cooking pots and pans because of its unrivaled heat conduction properties. And considering that these stills have to temper heats ranging anything between 600 and 700 degrees centigrade, it's undoubtedly a very appropriate choice of material. Surprising as it may sound, the flavour of the finished whisky is influenced greatly by the shape of the vessel it's distilled in. If a still has a short neck, the whisky is dominated by heavier oils, which give a more intense flavour, whereas a still with a long high neck will produce whisky of a much lighter character with less heavy oils in evidence. Here's the science bit. Alcohol boils at a lower temperature than water, which means therefore that it evaporates before the water does. Thus the wash is boiled so that the alcohol level rises to roughly 23 degrees in the vapour, which then condenses in a cooling plant of traditionally coiled pipes in cold water. This piece of equipment has always been referred to as the worm, and even though some of the newer, more technologically advanced versions have no coiled pipes whatsoever, to the whisky makers of Scotland, it's still a worm. The distillation process is then repeated a second time, and as with the very early whisky makers with their gunpowder, the modern day distiller needs to bring all his skills to bear to successfully draw off the middle cut or main run of the spirit. Although you'll see various gauges to aid this critical judgment, it still takes an experienced eye to call the shots. The foreshots are as poisonous as they ever were, and the aftershots are equally as undrinkable as in ancient times. However, recycling is certainly possible, and nothing is ever wasted, as anything unfit for consumption is simply fed back into the wash for redistillation. At this stage, the spirit is correctly termed as ethanol. It's not yet become whisky, and it's perfectly clear in colour. The alcohol content is also way higher than it should be, and so it's mixed with water in a whisky vat to make things a little more manageable. Finally, the potent concoction will be transferred to oak casks, some of which will have previously contained sherry, depending on the distillery, to mature for at least 3 years, allowing the whisky to mellow and to take on the rich golden colouring that we all know and love. A certain amount of whisky will evaporate during this final process, but even the thrifty Scot can do nothing to prevent this, and what's lost has to be philosophically written off as the angel's share. At Glenfiddich, there's also an opportunity to see the whisky being bottled, as this is one of the few distilleries to bottle on site. For the visitors who come and take the Glenfiddich tour in person, there's nothing so delightful as taking a wee dram of the finished whisky to judge for themselves what all the fuss is about. But fear not, Glenfiddich is readily available everywhere, and it's well worth the investment. You won't be disappointed. Having seen whisky being made in what has to be described as a state-of-the-art distillery, with roots very firmly based in tradition, there's one very significant aspect of the process that can be in danger of being overlooked. At the last stage of distillation, you have ethanol spirit that is colourless. It only becomes whisky after 3 years in storage. Therefore, something very special happens within the casks themselves, making what occurs over this prolonged maturing process very important. Our Whisky Trail now takes us to the Speyside cooperage, where oak casks are made and repaired to supply the whisky industry. The word cooperage actually dates back to the Roman era, the Latin for cask being cupel, and the term for the man making it, cuparius. Little has changed in 2,000 years in the way that the casks are made, and if you look at the tools of the trade being used here, it wouldn't take much to believe that they'd been unearthed at some archaeological dig. It has to be oak. Only oak will impart the flavours required to give the whisky its distinctive character. For Scotch whisky production today, 97% of the oak used comes from North America. It's a light variety that is a favourite for its elegance and delicate flavouring for specialist malts. As already mentioned, some distilleries use old Oloroso sherry casks, and a high proportion of the work carried out here at the Speyside cooperage is the repair and renovation of older casks. The flavour from the sherry-soaked casks always make for a richer and spicier whisky, which for some distilleries is an intrinsic part of their own specific taste. The parts of the cask, such as staves and hoops, should never be referred to as being fitted together. A true cask is raised up, and whether new or old, it needs to be fired. Not only will recycled casks be completely sterilised by this process, also the wonderful flavours of the wood will be completely restored to their former glories. It may seem an awful lot of effort to go to, keeping so many of these quite ancient casks in circulation, but with a lifespan of 60 years and like the fine whisky they hold, improving with age, it's well worth such careful husbandry of resources. Also, a brand new cask does cost in excess of £150, and after all, it's a fair price for such skilled work, but it wouldn't be in keeping with the very essence of Scotland if the distillers failed to ensure that they got their money's worth. Waste, as you have seen, is just not an option in the production of Scotch whisky, and even when these casks are beyond repair or complete sections have to be replaced, there's a huge demand for the discarded wood. Whisky is not the only treasure to come from Speyside. You don't have to look very far along the lovely riverbanks in season to find fly fishermen on an eternal quest for salmon. And of course, smoked salmon is a worldwide delicacy. So it'll come as no surprise that there are plenty of smokehouses in the area to make the most of Speyside's natural bounty. What you smoke the salmon with is absolutely key to the finished flavour, so what could be better than whisky-steeped wood shavings to cure your fish with? No small wonder that old casks are so highly prized.
Loud the winds howl, loud the waves roar, thunderclaps rend the air. Baffled our foes, stand by the shore, follow.
Now, as you're travelling through Speyside, considering the many wonderful varieties of Highland malt on offer, it would be very remiss not to consider, at least momentarily, the landscape of this fascinating region of the British Isles from a more sober perspective. But fear not, whisky is never far away, as our next destination will prove. Travelling a little further south of the Glenfiddich distillery and the Speyside cooperage, all the Scottish guidebooks will make mention of Tomintoul, one of the highest villages in the Highlands at 1,124 feet. In summer, it's a veritable tourist attraction, but today, in the winter chill, the main road through the village seems to wind away into the distance, stretching seemingly to nowhere. Regiments of the British Army were responsible for the construction of a fair proportion of the roads, which date back to the mid-18th century. The Hanoverian King George II and his court in London had the shock of their lives when Charles Edward Stuart, he of Over the Sea to Sky fame, better known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, raised enough support to have the crowns of both England and Scotland quite literally within his grasp. The fact that he was one of the few people who failed to realise this resulted in an ill-advised retreat and the death of his cause and his loyal Scottish followers on the bloody battlefield of Culloden. It was a narrow escape, and the court of King George dealt harshly with the Scottish nation as a whole. The playing of bagpipes was banned, clan chiefs were stripped of their authority, the wearing of tartan, sporting of kilts, and the owning of weapons were all forbidden, and the penalty was death. What's more, a major road building campaign was instigated in the Highlands, working on the theory that if you wanted to subjugate the Scots, you had at least to be able to get to them, which was no easy task in this terrain. Despite being a direct result of the 1745 Jacobite rebellion debacle led by the Bonnie Prince, the roads served another fiendish purpose. The English customs men, on the lookout for illegal Scotch whisky stills, could rub salt into the already considerable Scottish wounds.
Oh, you Jacobites by name, lend an ear, lend an ear. You Jacobites by name, lend an ear. Oh, you Jacobites by name, your thoughts I will proclaim. Your doctrines I must blame, you shall hear, you shall hear. Your doctrines I must blame, you shall hear. What makes it right and wrong? By the law, by the law. What makes it right and wrong? By the law. What is right and what is wrong? A short sword or a long, a weak hand or a strong, for to draw, for to draw. A weak hand or a strong, for to draw. You Jacobites by name, lend an ear.
And so, as is often the case on Speyside, we're back round to discussing whisky again. And from Tomintoul to Glenlivet, you're in the 19th century heart of whisky smuggling country. It's been recorded that there were at least 200 hidden stills along the valley of the River Livet, and hatred of the English revenue officers took on what can only be described as a religious zeal.
What makes ferocious strife? Toe up the assassin's knife, or hunt your parents' life with bloody war, bloody war, or hunt your...
After the failure of Bonnie Prince Charlie and the merciless massacre by the English of so many Scotsmen at Culloden, the political climate of this rough landscape was echoed in the desperate measures the inhabitants would go to in order to maintain their independence. John Gow had been an ardent supporter of Charles Edward Stuart's cause, and in the aftermath of reprisals after Culloden, he changed his name to John Smith to protect his family from the wrath of the conquering militia from south of the border. A farmer by day, John Smith transformed into an illicit whisky distiller by night, and he would have considered it treason against the Scottish cause to take a licence and make his whisky production legitimate. However, his grandson, George Smith, was one of the first distillers to commit this heretic deed under the Reforming Licence Act of 1823. Smith was encouraged to do so by his landlord, the penniless but landloaded Duke of Gordon, who saw the financial benefits of a legal export market. The Duke was in fact responsible for laying out the village of Tomintoul as we've seen it today, way back in 1779. George Smith was a brave man, selling his legal Glenlivet whisky far and wide, but the neighbouring still owners viewed him as a turncoat, a traitor to his Scottish heritage. For the rest of his life, Smith is reported to have carried 2 pistols with him wherever he went for protection. This is Minmore House, the property that George Smith built next to his Glenlivet distillery, evidently keen to be on hand in case of any trouble. Not only was George Smith's life always under threat, his livelihood was also attacked at every possible opportunity. Glenlivet quickly became very successful, and even King George IV, a later Hanoverian with a keen taste for wine, women and song, stated a preference for Glenlivet whisky, and every still owner in the district tried to get in on the act. Glenlivet brands sprang up in abundance, and George Smith had to take his case to law, fighting to become the rightful owner of the name Glenlivet. This is why, when you see the whisky of George Smith's company today, it's always prefixed as the Glenlivet. Livet, as in the river that gives its much fought-over name to this delightful whisky, actually means smooth-flowing one, and nothing could describe a wee dram of the Glenlivet better. This is a subtly balanced malt, offering a delicate bouquet with traces of both fruit and floral notes. The balance between medium sweetness and smooth dryness makes this a whisky that a novice would certainly enjoy, though at 43% it is a wonderful stronger option to encourage the developing palate. Also, as mentioned earlier, the Glenlivet could technically be labelled single malt Scotch whisky after just 3 years storage in the cask, but this distillery insists on a full 12 years for maturity to be reached, and some examples wait 21 years before bottling is even contemplated.
Hey Johnny Cope, are you walking yet? Or are your drums beating yet? If you were a walking, then I would wait to gang to the coals in the morning. Cope sent a challenge frae Dunbar, saying, Charlie, meet me and you dare. And all knew the art of war if you gang with me in the morning. When Charlie looked the letter upon, he drew his sword, the scabbard from. Come follow me, my merry men, and we'll meet Johnny Cope in the morning. Hop now, Johnny, be as good as your word. Come, let us try both fire and sword, and do nae flee like a frightened bird that's chased frae its nest in the morning. When Johnny Cope, he heard of this, he thought it wouldn't be amiss to have a horse in readiness to flee away in the morning. Hey Johnny Cope, are you walking yet, or are your drums beating yet? If you were a walking, then I would wait to gang to the coals in the morning. Pray now, Johnny, get up and run, for the Highland bagpipes make a din. It's better to sleep in the hailskin, for it will be a bloody morning. When Johnny Cope to Dunbar came, they sneered at him, where's all your men? The devil confound me to my ken, I left them away in the morning. Up now, John, you were not late to come with the news of your own defeat, and leave your men in such a strait so early in the morning. In faith, quoth Johnny, you got such flakes from their claymores and the filibegs. If I face them again, they'll break my legs, so I bid you all good morning.
The next distillery on the Whisky Trail is Glenfarclas, another example of a family concern that was started by J and G Grant in 1865 at the foot of the magnificent Ben Runes. However, although the name's the same, the Grants of Glenfarclas were not related to William Grant, the founding father of Glenfiddich. The Glenfarclas Grants are an enduring bunch, as 4 generations on, George Grant has enjoyed more than 50 years as chairman of this truly remarkable company. The future is assured in Grant's hands, as his son John is at present the company's MD. Whisky making must definitely run in this family's blood, as John Grant's son, another proud owner of the name George Grant, has in recent years started work at Glenfarclas, joining the family firm to learn all the tricks of the trade. A tough task indeed, and an incredibly high standard to live up to. Despite its isolated location, in excess of 60,000 visitors a year flock to Glenfarclas, and the quality of the facilities for those who appreciate fine whisky and wish to improve their knowledge of the subject are really excellent. Taking a tour round this distillery is just like stepping back in time, with Glenfarclas proudly boasting that the only thing that has been changed here in getting on for 200 years is the label. Malting and peat drying continues as it has done in ageless fashion, and when mountain stream water is added to the grist in the mash tun, one of Glenfarclas's most unique commodities is incorporated into the magical mix. Anyone who comes to Speyside and naively suggests that water is just water will soon be re-educated as to the extra special properties of the pure Highland spring water used here. As you've already seen, Ben Runes is pretty spectacular at 2,759 feet, and the crystal clear spring water flowing from high up on these slopes is often supplemented by melting snows. With traces of heather, peat, and granite infusing the water supply, the flavour is distinctive, and the ancient art of whisky distillation at Glenfarclas benefits greatly from this strategic natural resource. Incidentally, Glenfarclas means Valley of the Green Grassland, and it's appropriate that references to this all-important location is so fundamentally an integral part of this characterful whisky. Once the distillation process has worked its magic on the very best of natural Scottish ingredients in the great bubbling copper pot stills, the resulting spirit is transferred to the finest Spanish sherry casks for the aging process to begin. At Glenfarclas, the whisky casks are stored for their allotted years in traditional stone warehouses, where the fine mountain air can add its own rare quality to the blend. These are probably the finest examples of their type that you're likely to see anywhere, with a number of them dating back to the 1800s. Now, many of the distilleries produce whiskies that don't actually declare an age, whereas others have brands of various ages on offer. Glenfarclas has one of the widest age ranges available, and what's more, there are different strengths to choose from as well. From the 40% whisky that's typical of the majority of Highland malts, right through to an amazing 60% that is an absolute delight for the serious whisky drinker. Generally, Glenfarclas is acknowledged as one of the classic malts, with a rich sherry bouquet, a well-rounded fruity body, and a delicious mellow character. But do keep your eyes open on your travels for Glenfarclas 105. Cask strength at 60% proof. It is a deep, peaty flavour, fine, rich golden colour, and all the smoothness and dryness that you'd expect of a whisky of this quality. Okay, so this isn't one for the novice whisky drinker, but it's nice to know what you're working towards in developing a more sophisticated palate. And this single malt is most definitely to be savoured. If you're just starting out, pop this whisky down on your must-try list of precious treasures to look forward to in the not too distant future. Having considered Glenfiddich, the Glenlivet, and the Glenfarclas brands, this is a good point in the programme to briefly mention a selection of single malts that are worthy of your attention for future reference. Cragganmore is as romantically named a whisky as you'll ever find. This classic Speyside malt certainly has a complex character, with a surprisingly delicate aroma and a delightfully smoky finish. Look out for the Cragganmore Special Reserve, as this is extra smooth and well worth searching for. Sticking with the Speyside malts, the Macallan distillery produces whisky that is matured in sweet sherry casks. Needless to say, the finished malts have a rich, sherried aroma, but they also have a surprising hint of peachiness. This is a very mellow Scotch whisky, both smooth and elegant, and very popular. If you're looking for a single malt that's suitable for all palates, from the novice to the connoisseur, you'll not go far wrong with Cardew, a smooth, light malt with a silky character and delicate, sweet flavour. Although through the course of this programme, the main emphasis has been upon these wonderful Speyside malts, it's well worth travelling further afield to take in single malts from different regions of Scotland. The Dalwhinnie distillery is in point of fact only just south of Speyside and was built in the late 19th century. Most of the production was used for blended varieties, but in 1988 the Dalwhinnie single malt was developed. This is a perfect pre- or post-dinner dram, light and aromatic with a soft heather honey finish. Now, if by this stage in the proceedings you're feeling rather more adventurous, there are a whole host of single malts produced on Islay, where a peaty character distinguishes the whisky from this rugged Scottish island. Lagavulin is certainly quite pricey, so if you find a pub that serves this whisky, it's worth trying a glass before you invest in an entire bottle. It's not to everyone's taste, but if Lagavulin is to yours, you'll absolutely love it. This is a powerful brew with a dominant aroma, dry, peaty, smoky flavour, and just a hint of sweetness. Should you prefer to begin with a less gusty Islay single malt, Bunnabain is a distillery worth considering. It's not as characteristically peaty as other Islay malts, and is fresh, light and rather mellow. This whisky is a soft, smooth flavour, and is perhaps an altogether gentler introduction to Islay malts. Also, there are those that would recommend Talisker, the only malt whisky to be produced on the Isle of Skye, as a perfect halfway house between Highland and Islay malts. It's certainly full-bodied, with plenty of rich, peaty flavour, but it also has elements of the malty, fruity sweetness more in keeping with the Speyside malts that have been featured on this particular Whisky Trail. As our Whisky Trail is rapidly running out of time, it's only right and proper that we should conclude our journey by returning to Speyside and the region's oldest distillery to still be in production, Strathisla. Founded in 1786, records show that heather ale was made here by local clerics in the early 13th century, where a plentiful supply of barley and pure local spring water from a holy well made brewing very convenient. This was undoubtedly why the Milton Distillery, as Strathisla was first known, chose this ideal location in the 18th century. Strathisla is one of the most beautiful of the traditional distilleries in the Scottish Highlands, and visitors who come here are never disappointed. Fortunately, the same can be said for the devoted whisky drinker. A Strathisla 12-year-old malt at 43% proof is another precious treat for the connoisseur. Everything about this whisky is big and robust, with a full flavour and masses of fruitiness. There's an unexpected nutty sherried sweetness to this hard-hitting malt, and as your palate becomes more sophisticated, it's definitely a whisky that you'll really enjoy. And now, we really have run out of time, and if you're ever lucky enough to find yourself on Speyside, you'll soon realise that we've in fact only just begun on the many wonderful distilleries and whisky brands that grace this truly lovely region. However, if you just give the whiskies mentioned in this programme a try, you'll experience a wide range of flavours that will certainly help you to decide which of the single malts are likely to please you most. It's important too to remember that Speyside is not the only place where you can find great Scotch whisky. There are plenty of Scottish islands that produce single malts of their own distinctive characters, and there's a wealth of fascinating exploration to be undertaken to search them all out once you've mastered the basics. But be warned, appreciating Scotch whisky involves a lifetime of effort, and once you've started, there's no going back. Tough as it may sound, the whisky drinker has years of warming wee drams to take, and pleasures unbounded to fill hours of relaxation, because as this whisky trail has shown, we really are talking about the water of life. So here's to your very good health, and as they say in Scotland, Slange na bha.